Hi, Dan. Hello, hello.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Good. I was just enjoying some sun on our outdoor space terrace, actually. I might go back there in a little bit.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful here in DC today.
Yeah. Hey, guys.
Hi, how are you?
All good.
Thank you.
Is my mic okay? I'm just trying a new set of headphones.
That sounds great to me. Yeah.
Cool. Good.
Hi, Dan.
Hey, Phil, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Doing well, doing well. It is beautiful here in DC today.
Yeah.
What
Mind if I try just sharing my screen, Phil?
Yeah, that'd be great. I completely forgot why we even joined early. Looks good. And then, yeah, if you want to just...
Yeah, okay. Mm-hmm.
I guess just click, just click the slideshow.
And I can send you the link to this presentation when we're done.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great. Afterwards, I'd like to post all the slides on the event page with the recording, if that's okay with folks.
Okay, I did. It's 10 slides, but don't worry, I can make it in. If you tell me 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever, I'll shorten it. But I wanted for them to have all the information.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, I was thinking between 5 and 10 minutes, and a little time for Q&A if we have it. Hi, folks. Thanks for joining. We're just kind of getting set up here. Nita, do you want to try as well, sharing your screen?
Sure, yeah. This is totally optional, but let me see if I'll just try one slide. Oops. Okay. Is that showing up okay?
Looks good.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
Let's see if I can do the same.
Hi, folks. Thanks, Phil, for getting me up to date here. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, thanks for connecting. We're just getting set up here.
And I'll have to hop up after the first couple of minutes, but I'll go off mute or go on mute.
Everything look good sharing my screen right now? Yes, all right. All right, we'll just give it a few more moments as people start to join. Hey, Alex. All right, well, I think we can get started here. Folks will continue to join in, but we are recording this, so I wanted to make sure that was stated up front. Yeah, welcome. Thank you all for joining this public meeting for the U.S. Open Government National Action Plan here in DC on this beautiful spring day. If you're able to enjoy it, you're lucky. It's beautiful out here. And so we just have some introductions, and we're going to go over kind of the updates on where we're at with the National Action Plan 5 development process, the co-creation process, with some input and updates from the Open Government Partnership and from some civil society experts. And we'll learn about some other related open government efforts across the government, and really kind of get kicked off with this new National Action Plan. So I'm Phil Ashlock, and I'm coming to you from GSA, and I'm joined with colleagues from the White House and elsewhere. Here's the agenda that I just sort of summarized, and we'll go ahead and kick it off with some proper introductions. So why don't I first hand it off to Alex McElroy from the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Alex?
Hey folks, thank you very much. Thanks Phil, and thanks GSA. I'm Alex McElroy. I'm the Principal Deputy U.S. Chief Technology Officer. The reason why Phil had such a hard time with my last name is because it's kind of a bear to pronounce, and also because most people call me AMAC, and y'all are welcome to do that as well. I'm at the Office of Science and Technology Policy, like I say, and I get to work with a bunch of great scientists and technologists there. I came on in December, and I'm working to build the team and nominate our 5th US CTO. If you all have suggestions there, please shoot me a note. I'm just AMAC, AMAC, at ostp.eop.gov. Anyway, Phil asked me to say a little bit about why I care about open government. And I would say I started valuing it really as an offshoot to valuing access to information. Throughout my career before government, and I was also in the Obama administration, I got to work on a bunch of projects to make information more accessible to people. And I saw the impact of that. Government information is exceptional in that respect, in part because it's so useful and plentiful across so many fields, but also, at least in the United States, it is almost always usable without restrictions after its publication, which is, you all know this, I'm preaching to the choir, but that's extremely powerful, both for its use as information and for its use for innovation, which is something the Chief Technology Officer's office cares a lot about. In the Obama administration, I was privileged to work with Corey Zarek under CTO Megan Smith. And there I saw really firsthand the power of making change within government through the Open Government Partnership and through the push and pull of the National Action Plan co-development process. Corey and many of you that I recognize from your names on the Zoom today, she always stressed how important openness in government could be to holding government to account, and as a result, getting better government. And time and again, I saw the aspirations from the National Action Plan delivered as good practice, and then saw those NAP committed practices drive better government policy and results. And that is the core of what drives my belief in open government today and why I'm so happy to be here. I was really excited to get back into government under President Biden. He has a very straightforward commitment to restoring both the integrity and the competency of government, and that really resonates with me. In that context, it came as no surprise to find so many different threads of open government already underway in his administration, from the flurry of activities to restore some basic norms of good governance, to President Biden's work to restore scientific integrity in the federal government, something that OSTP cares a ton about, to his commitment to push the ideals of democracy forward at the Summit for Democracy. These initiatives strive for some of the same goals as open government, some even with the same tools, even though we had yet to really get going on our 5th National Action Plan. So it is great to be here with all of you to help kick off that 5-month co-development process. I know we haven't been the fastest out of the gate, and perhaps that's a gross understatement, but with Phil's work and support from the White House, I'm looking forward to catching up on the NAP delivery schedule and seeing what we can do in the meantime. Anyway, this is going to be a very, very busy time, so I'll stop talking and get to work.
Thank you, Alex. And we also have Justin Vale from the White House Domestic Policy Council. Justin, I don't know if you want to say a few words. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think we have audio from you, Justin, right now. I don't know if you're. Oh,
be better?
There we go. Yeah.
Great. Well, first, it's good to be here today with all of you. Thanks, Phil, for putting this together. I hope I am not going off schedule or agenda or calling out Sabeel if he's not ready. Phil, I didn't know if you planned on introducing Sabeel as well, but we can.
Happy to do so. Hi, Sabeel. Yes. Sabeel, I don't know if you want to introduce
Great.
yourself as well.
Yeah, hi folks, thanks for that. Sabeel Rahman, Senior Counselor at OIRA, and really excited to be joining this effort with AMAC and Justin and Phil and the whole team here. Very quickly come to this work from a long background in work on participatory governance, good governance, democracy reform. Before this was president of think tank Demos, which worked on racial equity and democracy reform, among many other things. And as AMAC suggested, right, there are lots of cross-connecting work streams that I think we're really excited about syncing this up with in terms of, for example, our work on equity, our work on increasing access for communities to government services, and a bunch of other similar efforts. And so really appreciate the expertise here and look forward to working with you all.
Thanks, Sabeel.
Great. Thanks for letting me have Sabeel say hi, because I know he may not be able to stick around, and wanted to make sure that you all saw his face, because he's going to be such an important part of this work going forward, and is really, exemplary of the kind of cross coordination across the White House and administration that we are driving forward right now. Because this administration is committed to restoring, strengthening, and expanding American democracy. We know that doing so requires us to build and ensure an open, accountable, and participatory government that works for the people. As many of you know, and as AMAC mentioned, we hosted a global summit for democracy last December, where we reaffirmed our commitment to promote transparency and accountability. Since then, we've been working hard to continue delivering on that commitment. For example, Attorney General Garland recently introduced comprehensive guidance on how all federal agencies must respond to requests for information under the Freedom of Information Act. This guidance requires agencies to apply a presumption of openness, and it makes it easier for the public and press to obtain information. That's just one example. The OGP process, as all of you know, will really help us galvanize and coordinate additional impactful actions and commitments across government, so that we can be driving policy immediately. And when we head into that second Summit for Democracy, we'll have a strong record and a vision for open government that we can celebrate. We recognize that we have a lot of catching up to do, and we have a lot of work to do together. So I want to echo Sabeel and AMAC's thanks to Administrator Carnahan and GSA for helping advance the administration's open government work. I'll turn it back over to you, Phil. I'll just give one quick housekeeping note that at least those at the White House are not able to see the chat. Don't want to discourage you from using the chat, but we always want to make sure that we benefit from your input. So want to make sure that you're aware that us at the White House can't see that. Thanks again, Phil.
Thanks, Justin. So as I said before, I'm Phil Ashlock. Coming from GSA, and GSA is working to provide additional staff capacity support with these White House offices to drive this work forward and to have deeper engagement with all of you as we go through this co-creation process. So I'm just going to jump to just a high-level overview of where we're thinking this process is going to go over the coming months. for co-creating, developing this next national action plan. We had shared sort of a high-level timeline before, and if you recall, that timeline, we may be a little behind in starting, but we feel pretty confident that we are not going to be behind in getting to the finish line later this year, as we'd originally envisioned. This is a pretty high-level overview of kind of what the next couple of months look like, and this generally follows the sort of multi-phased approach that's recommended in places like the Open Government Partnership Handbook, and as I think we've seen from other countries with a robust co-creation process. This is a lot more involved than the development of the plans have been in the past. So we're really looking to set this in motion and to have a kind of meaningful dialogue with all of you. And later in the meeting, I'll get into a little bit more detail of what to expect sort of in the next month. And I think as we'll learn, just as we hear more about the kind of guidelines and recommendations around the National Action Plan process, technically we can't officially launch the co-creation process until we've officially posted a plan for the co-creation process. I don't know that we would consider this that plan yet, but we are hoping to have what we would consider a sort of official plan for the co-creation process within the week. And then that would kick off that sort of 2-week timer for when the co-creation process kind of formally officially launches. So that will be coming over the next couple of weeks, and we'll officially launch this process. But we wanted to make sure everyone is aware of kind of what this process looks like up front, and get feedback, and we can iterate and improve the process as we move forward. So now that you've sort of gotten a sense of sort of what this process looks like, which is as this slide indicates, starting with an initial phase of just soliciting high-level ideas and getting a better sense of kind of problem definitions, also being able to highlight existing recommendations that civil society has already put out. So, we don't want to pretend like we need to necessarily start from scratch or ignore the work that civil society has already done to develop recommendations here. So we want to be able to highlight and recognize that. And then, that will lead into sort of a more refined shaping period, which will help identify kind of key themes. I think moving from that point forward, much of the work will kind of be centered around getting more targeted expertise and input around those thematic areas. So moving into the summer, we expect to have kind of workshops focused on those thematic areas and really start drafting the commitments. That would then ultimately lead to developing a first draft of the action plan with additional consultation and feedback before we work to finalize it and run that through all the different kind of clearance processes that will be necessary on our side, and publish it at the beginning of the fall. That is the plan, and we will do our best to stick with it, and we will be providing updates, as I said, in the next week as this is kind of officially launched, and we can really get underway with getting input from all of you. And fortunately, we have some experts here to provide both us in government and all of civil society and everyone else sort of a deeper understanding of what the National Action Plan process looks like, from a kind of global perspective from the Open Government Partnership, sort of how this applies to all countries, and then we'll get some input on some considerations that can be more specific to us here in the United States. So to get started with that, pleased to welcome Alonso Cerdan from the Open Government Partnership. to give us a little bit of an overview of the updated Open Government Partnership Handbook. Alonso, over to you.
Thank you, Phil. Could you please stop sharing so I can share my screen?
Yes, I can. And there you go.
Thank you. So I have a very short presentation. It's 10 slides, but it's going to be a short presentation, I promise, because I want to talk to you about, it's about the handbook and the new participation and co-creation standards. That's what caused, that was what makes us update all of the handbook and all of our guidance materials. These standards were approved by the steering committee of OGP last November after a 2-year process in which we consulted and we thought about what were the rules that we had and how could we improve them. We used to have 55 standards and now we only have 5. So we have really tried to be as flexible as possible, while at the same time trying to encourage for greater ambition from all the countries, to eliminate overlaps, to simplify the structure, and to be very clear about what's expected, what's the minimum requirement, and what ambition could potentially look like, but providing for flexibility because ambition will look different in different contexts. As I said, there's 5 standards that, but I'm not gonna read all the text, but basically they refer to, first one has to do with having a multi-stakeholder forum with government, civil society, a space for dialogue, an ongoing dialogue. Second one is about having publication, like publishing information about the OGP process and about the implementation of the commitments, because it's 2022 and it's about open government. Third and fourth have to do with basic requirements on the co-creation process. This is, I think, something that Phil was referring to. And finally, standard 5 has to do with what happens during implementation. That's the big overview. And the way that these standards are structured, if you go and see the actual standards, all of them have the same structure. They talk about first what ambition looks like and why it's important. Then there's some approaches about how to go to try to comply with this standard. And then finally, and it's at the very end on purpose, there's the minimum standard, but these should be seen as like just the basic requirement, not what countries should be striving for. So for example, on this one, it's what we've seen is that having a multi-stakeholder forum and the 10 years of information that we assessed and published last year, it's usually positively correlated with higher completion rates and very strong early results. This means very strong commitment. And several countries have established some form of this forum. It can be called secretariat, it can be very formal, it could be informal, it could be just a space for dialogue. It depends on the country. And the minimum requirement that all countries have to comply is that there is this space or platform for ongoing dialogue between government and civil society that meets at least every 6 months, and that there's basic rules on what participation in this space looks like. On the second one, as I said, it's quite simple. It's about having a website where all the key information about OGP processes and implementation of commitments, once the action plan is completed, is stored. There has to be also evidence about the completion of the commitment, and it has to be updated twice a year. The third one is about the co-creation process. Information, the evidence suggests that strong or high levels of public participation lead to more diverse action plans, to more ambitious commitments, and it allows for a wider range of stakeholders to provide information and provide input. And what we've seen is, and this is like already, Phil, you're doing it, publishing a timeline is very important so actors can prepare and know what are the key moments in which they can participate, that there's general basic methodologies about how the information is going to be gathered, how the decision-making process is going to take place, what is the core methodology, what are you going to use, like I think you said, working tables, how is the action plan going to be co-created? And this is the standard that has the most minimum requirements. There's 3 of them that have to do with publishing the timeline and an overview of opportunities for stakeholders to participate, conducting outreach activities to raise awareness, and then developing some sort of mechanism to gather inputs. And this is on purpose, it's vague because the mechanism to gather inputs is going to look very different from country and from region to region. So we don't want to prescribe, we just want to say, like, you have to think about how to go about this. Standard 4 has to do with providing a reasoned response on why some commitments made it and how commitments were built. Again, this is one of the key components. Like, we see that when there's a response for input and feedback, action plans have a high correlation with ambition, with completion, and it's the key predictor for strong action plans. So now it's a minimum requirement, and there's different ways to go about it. You can publish a summary of stakeholder contribution. You can assess commitment proposals through an open process and then publish the overview of what happened. You can then at the end present a selection of commitments and include justifications. But also these could be that if, for example, there's a workshop with thematic working tables, then you could publish the minutes of what was the discussion and what was the agreement during those sessions. So there's a lot of ways to go about it. But yes, for this standard, the minimum requirement is that the government documents and reports back or publishes written feedback to stakeholders on how their contributions were considered. And just the final one has to do, and it won't apply for a while, has to do with implementation. We've seen that when there's continued dialogue throughout the implementation process, there's higher levels of completions and stronger results. So again, we're striving to maintain this dialogue. They could be like in open meetings that allow implementing agencies to provide updates on commitment completion and then listen to comments from civil society. This is something that the US used to do for their, I think the third action plan, 2014-2016, or there's also countries that maintain a public dashboard that keeps up-to-date information on completion of commitments. And the minimum requirement is that there's at least 2 meetings every year with civil society where the results are presented and the government collects commitments. I did a very, very fast and short description of the minimum of the new standards. And there's 2 key components that I'm going to link in the chat. There's the actual standards, and then we worked over the last few months to generate the guidance materials to implement these new standards. And it's the OGP National Handbook that was just published a few weeks ago that contains a lot more information about how to actually comply with the minimum requirements, with the standards, and how to go about and how to build a successful OGP process. So that's it from my side, and happy to answer any question.
Thank you so much, Alonso. If it's okay with everyone else, I think we'll give the floor to Neda to provide a little bit more consideration and context for this process in the US, and then we'll open it up to Q&A for both of you, if that's okay.
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right, thanks. Over to you, Neda. I think this is Neda Zodri from the Global Integrity.
Yep, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Really happy to be here and to hear these updates to really revive the next National Action Plan process. My name is Neda. I'm the director of the Open Gov Hub, and I also worked as an independent consultant with OGP last year, specifically to understand civil society perspectives on how the new Biden administration could revive and improve this process. So my goal today is to be pretty brief and just build upon Alonso's comments to think about what are some specific considerations for us here in the United States in terms of how we apply the good practices that OGP offers for a successful co-creation process. So I think the good news that some of the other speakers have already alluded to is just how powerful the vehicle of open government reforms can be to really capture a wide range of different policy concerns and a wide range of stakeholders, both reformers, inside and outside of government. So I think we continue to have the opportunity to really seize the huge potential that comes with this process. And also, as Alonso just said, the more public participation and true co-creation, the more likely the outcomes will be successfully implemented and have strong impacts based on 10 years of OGP's research. So the goal, I think, is again really to tap that full potential. At the same time, we need to look back to know where we can head forward. And so I want to first just really quickly summarize some of the key challenges that have come up in the history of the OGP process here in the US. This is really just summarizing a lot of the work from the IRM at the OGP, but just to bring this back to the top of our minds, we know that one key challenge in the past has been inconsistent government leadership and ownership of the process over the years. OGP has been housed in a number of different parts of government, and there's been a little bit of inconsistency sometimes with how much resources and prioritization that gets. But again, it's really great to see this renewed effort to pull together the resources necessary to really, again, make this a priority with White House leadership and across government with coordination at various levels. A second historic challenge for US OGP has been really limited and ad hoc channels for public engagement. So again, the OGP handbook gives us some good basic standards to think about for that public engagement process for this next plan. A third historic challenge has been lack of new or very ambitious reforms. So I encourage us all to think about how we can, not just include some easier wins within the next National Action Plan, but also what can really raise the level of ambition. And then a final challenge in the past has been opaque process for how commitments actually get finalized and limited feedback provided. So again, it's really important to think about the full cycle of this process and what happens to the public input, which doesn't end up getting included in the final plan. So with that in mind, I just want to touch on something that comes from the OGP handbook, which outlines kind of the 4 stages of the process. Phil also touched on this with the timeline that was just presented. But I want to just touch on a few key considerations, again, specific to us here in the United States. So the first phase is this critical planning phase, which needs to clarify the objectives of the process, the key roles, the resources that can be allocated to it, as well as the actual timeline for what will take place. So this is the first place to start. And I think one thing in particular we should keep in mind is how much the criteria for how commitments will be evaluated can be shared as early as possible, basically. That will just really help make sure that when the channels open up to receive public feedback, and inputs, those can be as relevant as possible and have a stronger likelihood of kind of inclusion into the process if the criteria is provided well in advance and at the very first stage of the planning process. So I think that's one key consideration for us to really hopefully address in the near term. And then secondly, we will then move into this outreach process. Certainly one of the top recommendations from the research we did last year was the need to really diversify civil society participation in this process. Again, we know that there are kind of the good government, groups, usual suspects, but there's also so many open government reforms that we could use in the United States, which cut across a variety of issue areas and a variety of populations. So we really need to think about underrepresented groups and how to include them in the process, as well as leveraging the intermediaries who already aggregate public opinion and different civil society perspectives on policy issues. So key coalitions that are active on these issues as well. Third stage in the process is actually developing the action plan. So again, the OGP handbook goes into great details here about how to do that effectively. But I think the research conducted last year with this Seize the Moment report can also just help begin the process of outlining some tentative thematic areas. Again, based on the consultations that I helped lead with a variety of civil society actors last year. So I think the key point here, again, is just to, as you said, Phil, build upon existing resources, not starting from scratch, but really building upon previous consultations and many civil society reports also that aggregate top policy reform recommendations from a variety of civil society actors. Just one example of that briefly is the Accountability 2021 report that came out from the Open the Government Coalition, early at the beginning of this administration. So fourth and final stage in this co-creation process, of course, is feedback. So given the previous concerns with some of previous iterations of the US OGP process, I think this is especially important that we do justice to the importance, again, of kind of delivering a reasoned response and reporting back to people how their contributions were considered. Whether or not they actually make it into the final plan is honestly, I think, a little bit less important than making sure that people know what was the final outcome, again, what was the criteria used to evaluate and finalize those final commitments in the next National Action Plan. And this is absolutely essential for maintaining trust and faith in the process, and for future co-creation efforts between government and civil society reformers. So I will leave it there to move into our discussion, and I will also put a link into the chat for anyone who may have missed the report that came out last year, consolidating civil society opinions about how to really strengthen and improve the US OGP process. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Neda, and thank you, Alonso, as well. And I'd like to open the floor up or the chat up for any questions based on Alonso and Neda's presentations. And I'm also happy to read questions from the chat if that works better for folks. See if there are any questions in here. See some recommendations. I see a question about, I guess, why there perhaps wasn't a broader invitation to the public and the press to join the meeting today. I think, as outlined, I'm happy to let my colleagues at the White House respond to that as well. But I think, as outlined in the kind of timeline that we're going through here, this stage right now is kind of preparing and finalizing what this process, the co-creation process, looks like. And as we release that kind of full plan and start that 2-week period before it launches, I think the hope is that will kind of begin the kickoff of a much more extensive public outreach and communications plan. So we thought it would be good to start here today with an opportunity to sort of get input and feedback on what this process looks like before we kind of fully launch the process with a more extensive kind of inclusive outreach campaign. But that is the hope and the plan moving forward. But I don't know if there's any other questions. Oh, I see that question was directed to the White House. Happy to let any of my colleagues from the White House respond as well.
I'm happy to. Seems like a good point, and should have made it more public.
Thank you, Alex and Alex. Any other questions? Okay, well, let me see if I can pull up my slides again here and we can move on to, so let me share my screen again. All right. Okay, so next on the agenda, and this was mentioned by Alonso as well as part of the standards. So this idea of a multi-stakeholder forum to have kind of a designated place or organizational body to support and oversee this process with civil society and government together. So, you know, as I think we discussed at the last meeting, and we had our friends from Canada come and present an overview of their multi-stakeholder forum. Here in the US, you know, we do not currently have kind of a formally designated kind of robust multi-stakeholder forum. You know, I think this is something that's evolved as a best practice and as part of, you know, kind of more specifically part of the OGP standards over time. So this is something we're working to establish. I think to the extent that we do have a place and a process for this at the moment, it's here and now. You're part of it with these types of convenings and with the mailing list and other kind of opportunities for dialogue that exist in sort of the simple, more kind of informal forum. But you know, we recognize the need to work to establish something more robust. And you know, if you joined the last meeting and heard from Canada or watched the recording, I think, you know, Canada provides a good example of kind of what kind of a more established forum looks like. And as we've gone through the process and the White House has explored this with GSA, you know, it looks like what we really want here is something that ends up involving, you know, a whole other set of processes that exist in government for just this type of thing. So I'm referring to things like federal advisory committees. So we are looking at sort of what that process would sort of entail to formally establish that. And we also recognize that process may take a little more time, which and we don't want to delay this process further. So we're working to establish a more formal multi-stakeholder forum, but that is not going to delay the overall process of co-creating and developing this national action plan. We are going to do those both in parallel as much as possible over the coming months, with the intent of having a more formal framework and organizational body to comprise this multi-stakeholder forum to be in place in the next coming months to be part of the final development of this new national action plan. So it is still a work in progress, but fortunately, there's a lot that we can build on in this endeavor. I'm fortunate that GSA as an agency helps manage things like federal advisory committees on behalf of the whole government. So I'm grateful to be able to benefit from some of my colleagues here around that type of work. And there are many sort of existing bodies like this that support engagement with civil society and outside experts to drive processes like this forward. And ultimately, what we hope to establish within new multi-stakeholder forum is really something that can be a hub that can connect to more domain-specific areas of open government, one of which we have here today, which is the Freedom of Information Act and the existing advisory committee around that. So I'm very thankful that my colleague from the National Archives has agreed to come and give us a little bit of an overview of that advisory committee, which I think will also help us inform us of what an overarching open government multi-stakeholder forum advisory kind of group might look like. But really, I think the hope is to have a network of these types of groups and to build on a lot of the existing groups that already exist. So with that, let me introduce Alina Semo, who oversees the FOIA Advisory Committee from NARA. Over to you, Alina.
Great. Can everyone hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. And I don't know if my camera is working because all of a sudden I am unable to see myself. Can everyone else see me?
I can see you and I can hear you.
Great. Wonderful. Well, thank you again for inviting me to come and talk this afternoon, Phil. I just prepared a few thoughts about and to share some ideas with you about what we do in the FOIA Advisory Committee. But let me introduce myself to those of you who don't know me. I am Alina Simo, Director of the Office of Government Information Services at the National Archives and Records Administration. We are the FOIA Ombudsman for the entire federal government. And if I could ask you to go to the next slide, Phil, that would be great. So the next slide is a great picture that I love, and I just want to briefly tell you, this was the last time probably the Federal Advisory Committee, the FOIA Advisory Committee met in person at the McGowan Theater, the National Archives in downtown DC before the pandemic hit us. We've actually been meeting virtually since March of 2020. So it's a nice reminder of times in the past, but it's a nice visual reminder of collaboration. So I think it's just a nice picture to have visually. One of the ways that OGIS tries to improve the administration of FOIA is through our work through the FOIA Advisory Committee, which I chair. And the committee was established in accordance with the US second Open Government National Action Plan that was released in December of 2013. And we also use the committee to help OGIS identify procedures and methods for improving compliance with the FOIA, which is what Congress has asked us to do. We have had 3 complete terms of the committee thus far, 2014 to 2016, 2016 to 2018, 2018 to 2020. And the current committee term that we're in is wrapping up 2 more public meetings, May 5th and June 9th. And I want to apologize to everyone if you're hearing my puppy barking. This was not part of the planned presentation. So I apologize. We have 2 more meetings coming up, May 5th and June 9th. We have been hard at work for the last 2 years with 4 subcommittees that have broken out into 4 subject areas: legislation, process, classification, and technology. And they've all been actively engaged in meeting and trying to figure out ways to improve the FOIA process. What I think is a critical difference between the FOIA Advisory Committee and the multi-stakeholder forum or platform envisioned by the Open Government Partnership is that the committee is governed by the Federal Advisory Committee Act, FACA, which Phil mentioned earlier. And FACA actually has very specific requirements, statutory requirements, and requires each committee to have a designated federal officer whose duties are spelled out in the statute. DFOs, designated federal officers, are responsible for many of the administrative behind the scenes running of the committees and must be present at all committee and subcommittee meetings, prepare and approve meeting agendas, and maintain records of all committee activities. FACA and the Government and Sunshine Act require that all full committee meetings be open to the public and allow for either oral or written public comments. And we have formal voting requirements on recommendations that the committee moves forward that we take at various points during the committee term. We normally meet 4 times a year. More meetings happen in the second year because we have usually more work than we need to get done. And we have found it very successful to have the subcommittees and working groups establish regular meetings and have them set and cancel them only as needed. But certainly, despite the fact that we follow the FACA, which has very strict statutory requirements, the spirit of the committee is the same. It brings together members of the FOIA community from inside and outside of government to collaboratively identify the greatest challenges in the administration of FOIA and develop recommendations for the Archivist of the United States. The government members come from a range of agencies, from cabinet level departments to small independent agencies. In fact, on the call today, I see a couple of at least one former member of our committee. Will not call them out. For non-government representation, we have individuals representing the interests of requesters who fall into various FOIA requester fee categories: commercial, news media, all other, as well as representatives from the historians and academia communities. And again, not calling anyone out, but I see also another former non-government member here on the call today. A few interesting comments that some of our non-government committee members have made this term have been how much they've actually enjoyed working with their government counterparts. I think some of them were a little surprised, and how much they have learned about the FOIA process in the federal government. I think there was a lot of learning that went on the part of non-government members. So that has been a very successful part of the partnership. If I could ask you to go to the next slide, please. So we have created a terrific recommendations dashboard in order to keep track of the great work the committee has done since it was stood up in 2014. The link is right here on that slide that everyone is welcome to go and check out. The current term of the committee has passed a number of recommendations, but since our final report has not yet been finalized or presented to the archivist, we are holding off on updating the dashboard once everything has been finalized. But so far, I believe we're at least up to about 11 or 12 recommendations that have passed. I'm not 100% sure of the number, but that sounds about right. The archivist asked us not to give him as many as the last term, which was 20. So we're trying to keep it under 20. Next slide, Phil. Just want to invite everyone to join us for our last two meetings. If you actually want to see the FOIA Advisory Committee in action, you can register through our Eventbrite via our webpage at archives.gov/OGIS, or you can tune in via the NARA YouTube channel. And the last two meetings are May 5th and June 9th. And they both start at 10 a.m. And we hope you can join us. And that's all I have, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Alina. Do we have any questions? Okay, well, thank you again, Alina, and we will definitely be in touch as we all move forward and find ways to build on each other's work here. So thank you again for joining today. Okay, so moving forward on the next steps for the National Action Plan co-creation process. So at the beginning, I sort of provided a high-level overview of what the next several months will look like. And as I said before, we are working on a more detailed plan describing this co-creation process. And as we go through each phase, we'll provide additional details of each phase. And to begin with, I just kind of want to provide a little bit more detail of sort of where we're at over the next month or so. So we are in the kind of early preparation stage as we finalize the plan, the co-creation plan. And so that will be finalized and released in the coming weeks, which will then, as I said before, begin this 2-week kind of timer for when the co-creation process will officially launch. And at that point, we hope to do much more substantial outreach and communications to bring more people into the process and to identify organizations that have already done or already doing similar work and can be a channel to connect to this process. We'll also be launching a pretty simple input form on the Open Government website to begin to solicit some initial ideas for the commitments, and also to help identify, where some commitments may have already been developed. As has been mentioned, there are civil society organizations and coalitions of organizations, some of whom have already developed updated commitments and recommendations here. So we want to be able to identify and highlight those. So again, we don't necessarily need to start from scratch where there's already a lot of this great work that's already been done and is being done. And then roughly a month from now, we'll have another convening where we'll invite all of you back and more civil society participants, both to share some of the kind of initial thinking, as well as to perhaps highlight some of these existing recommendations that may be already out there. And we'll also provide more details as we sort of move the process forward through these multiple phases. So we don't have a set date for the next meeting in May, but as I said, it will be likely about a month from now. And so we will post that on the Open Government mailing list and website. And as I said, we'll be doing a lot more communications and outreach over the coming weeks and months as this process sort of fully comes underway. So that is where we're at and where we're going. And we have some additional time for Q&A towards any questions about this process or questions for our presenters. Happy to open the floor up for a little bit, but please stay tuned for next additional details and the next steps here. So please be subscribed to the Open Government mailing list if you're not already. And watch for updates on the Open Government website as that gets more fully developed out with this upcoming launch. Let's see, do we have any questions? Let me look at the chat here. There's a question about whether workshops will be in person and virtual. Yes, the intent is to have both in person and virtual workshops. I think as we're all still navigating evolving policies around travel and COVID. I think in many cases, many of these convenings and workshops will probably be primarily virtual, but we'll definitely be looking for opportunities for in-person as well. Let's see other questions. Will this timeline be published on open.usa.gov? Yes. So the timeline for the co-creation process that was shared at a high level in the slides here, that will be published with additional detail on open.usa.gov. See other questions here. Will there be a email address for NAP5? I'm not sure. I think we'll work to provide whatever communications mechanisms work best. The links to these meetings be published on open.usa.gov. Yes, they will be. Will the White House retweet OGP and post this video? I'm not sure that I can click that, but I don't know if we have any of my colleagues from the White House that are in a position to respond to any of the White House direct questions. Oh,
I think I'm allowed to do that.
So Alex, I think there is just a question about whether the White House would tweet about President Biden's speech to OGP. I think that's the question.
I'm happy to look at it. I have not seen it lately. It might be weird to tweet something so long ago, and also kind of weird to be taking orders of what to tweet. But happy to look at it.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Phil, could I chime in with 2 quick questions if we have a second? Yeah, thank you so much. First question for Alina. It was really helpful to hear the example of the advisory committee. And I just wanted to know if you could speak a little more to the subcommittee's work, because I think that's going to be really essential for the OGP process, given the wide range of different departments and different, policy thematic areas that this could cover. Yeah, any good practices that you've learned about the subcommittee work where the rubber hits the road kind of thing.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So we've really let the subcommittees develop organically at our opening meetings each term, and we've let the committee members actually decide what subcommittees would seem to be most relevant in terms of the work that's going on. And from there, the working groups have also formed within each of the subcommittees based on areas of interest that the committee members have. So we've really let that develop organically. We haven't dictated, we have to have X amount of committees, X amount of subcommittees rather, and X amount of working groups. It's just sort of happened over time, and it's varied with each term. So I would say, I think that's been a good practice, not forcing topics or subject matter areas, but letting the actual members participate. The other comment I was going to make is, and I think Phil actually mentioned this earlier, is FACA is somewhat restrictive, has a lot of rules that you have to follow. I'm not sure it's the best model to follow. That's just my personal experience based on what I've been going through as chairperson of a FOIA advisory committee and a FACA committee. And I think it might just be better to have just an open, engaged partnership between the civil society groups and the government, and try to get those ideas, formed and discussed in an open forum. I hope that helps.
Thanks, that was a good question and really helpful considerations, Alina. We are coming close to the top of the hour, and I think we'll close down, and if there aren't any other questions. But I really appreciate everyone joining today. We'll be posting a recording of this on the event page, and as I've mentioned a few times, we have a number of updates that will be coming out over the coming weeks as this co-creation process formally launches. So please stay tuned, and looking forward to getting all of your input and also bringing more people into this process and making it more inclusive. So also, encourage you all to reach out to folks and help us identify, more people that we can bring into this process to really make it robust and have a thriving community here. So again, thank you all, and look forward to reconnecting with you all very soon. Take care, everyone, and hope you can enjoy this beautiful spring day. At least it's beautiful here in DC. Okay. Take care, everyone.